Good afternoon. I am Steve Hauge, Chair of the Eisenhower Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this special panel discussion of Brown versus Board of Education in this 70th anniversary year of the 1954 Supreme Court decision. This anniversary offers us an opportunity to reflect on the progress our nation has made toward equality and justice. We are also reminded of the pivotal role that Dwight D. Eisenhower played in this era, from 1948 to 53 as the president of Columbia University, and thereafter as the 34th president of the United States. The foundation would like to extend its gratitude to Columbia Law School, the friends and family of Herbert Brownell, and Fiduciary Trust for their valuable support in making this event possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce Daniel Abubu, Dean, and Lucy G. Moses, Professor of Law at Columbia School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Dean Abubu.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to have all of you here in attendance, both here in Morningside Heights, and of course, for those people who are watching over Zoom. On behalf of the law school, I want to welcome you to Columbia for today's program. I guess it comes somewhat as a footnote on a resume that includes serving as the 34th President of the United States and the Supreme Commander of NATO's allied forces. But as I hope all of you know, President Dwight D. Eisenhower also served as president of Columbia University, as you heard, from 1948 to 1953. Though his term as president of Columbia was frankly punctuated and abbreviated by other calls to service, President Eisenhower deeply believed in the promise of American universities as a meeting place for ideas, where courageous scholarship would help break through some of the most intractable challenges of our time, or of that time. And after departing Columbia and moving from one presidency to another, President Eisenhower returned to New York to give an address at Columbia's bicentennial event in 1954. In his speech, he shared, and I quote, "The pursuit of truth, its preservation and wide dissemination, the achievement of freedom, its defense and propagation. These purposes are woven into the American concept of education. The American university, neither the property of a favored class, nor an ivory tower where visionaries are sheltered from the test of practice. Every American university is fundamentally dedicated to Columbia's bicentennial theme, man's right to knowledge and the free use thereof," end quote. I have to say that I am proud that this type of deeply engaged scholarship continues to have a home at Columbia University and at Columbia Law School, much in the same way that President Eisenhower indeed hoped it would. And I think tonight, as we think about President Eisenhower's legacy on issues of civil rights, I'm honored that we have such a distinguished panel of scholars to help us navigate this very weighty topic, whose ideas are certainly not sheltered from the test of practice. So I'm particularly grateful to Alada Johnson and Jeremy Kessler, two of Columbia Law School's exceptional faculty members and also wonderful colleagues who joined the panel. It's also great to see Justin Driver and Paul Stuffin, who are longstanding friends and distinguished colleagues from other law schools that I won't mention today. I also want to extend my thanks to the Eisenhower Foundation and to all who contributed to organizing today's event, including our moderator, Nick Rasta, who himself is a distinguished practitioner of international law and a member of the Eisenhower Foundation's board. Thank you all once again for joining us tonight, and please join me in welcoming Nick Rasta.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to add my thanks to all of you in the audience at the Columbia Law School and through the miracles of cyber and the ether, as long as you don't use a pager or some other primitive device, to join us here from institutions of higher learning around the country and people on their own laptops. And I'd like to add my thanks to Dean Abova and the Columbia Law School for being host with us. It's altogether fitting. And I'm glad to have heard the quotation from President Eisenhower on the value of education. Somehow, what he had to say is of deep importance to us today, just as his farewell address emphasizing balance was of great importance. I'm going to offer brief introductions, very brief, of our panelists, and then offer each of them some minutes for opening remarks, and then we're going to have a discussion, questions from the audience. I'll not offer my own views of Eisenhower, but note that his impact on the advancement of civil rights was not limited to his role in appointing judges of a certain outlook and formation, and to his role in the Brown against Board of Education decision and the position of the United States government. But he also appointed the first non-hereditary and native people governor of American Samoa, Peter Talley Coleman, who served in that position for 3 terms and became a leader in the decolonization of American territories in the Pacific. And this appointment is an example of Eisenhower's forward-leaning approach to such matters and deeply held anti-colonialist views. Our panel's biographies are available on the internet through their home institutions. And for those of you with the program, there's a QR code that goes to their biographies. They're all highly regarded in their fields and have earned multiple awards for their scholarly work. So I'm not going to list them each, if they will forgive me. But I will say a few words about each of them, very few words, in the order in which they'll speak. Justin Driver is the Robert R. Slaughter Professor of Law at the Yale Law School. He is a legal historian and professor of constitutional law. One of his notable publications is The Schoolhouse Gate, Public Education, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for the American Mind. His topic today is Eisenhower and constitutional rights and decisions that shaped his civil rights legacy. James Simon was a distinguished dean of the New York Law School, which, if my memory is correct, broke away from the Columbia Law School in the early 1890s over a dispute about teaching methods, resistance to the case method, something like that. Anyway, Professor Simon is the author of a number of important and prize-winning works of American legal and political history, including Eisenhower v. Warren, which is the subject of his remarks today. Paul Stephen is the John C. Jeffries Jr. Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. He has served at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and is coordinating reporter for the Restatement Fourth of the Foreign Relations Law of the United States. Today, he will address Eisenhower and race relations during World War II and his critically important appointment of Herbert Brownell as Attorney General, about whom I will add a few remarks at the appropriate moment, if I can find it. Jeremy Kessler is the Stanley H. Fuld Professor at the Columbia Law School. He is a legal historian writing primarily about First Amendment law, administrative law, and legal theory. His forthcoming book will explore the impact of the military draft on civil liberties and the administrative state. Professor Kessler will discuss Eisenhower, conscription, and executive power. William Hitchcock is the James Madison Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He is the author of numerous prize-winning books, including of greatest relevance to us today, The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. His remarks will focus on the historical sweep of Eisenhower and civil rights. And last, but by no means least, Professor Olatunde Johnson is the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law at the Columbia Law School, where she has had a big impact as a scholar, a teacher, and an administrator. She is a constitutional scholar with a focus on civil rights in our times. Professor Johnson will address the topic of the relevance of Eisenhower's civil rights legacy for today. Professor Driver, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for. Yes, I would turn it on. It's at the top. It's on. It's on. Okay. All right. Thanks so much. That sounds much better, doesn't it? I'm really glad to be here today and honored to participate on this panel. I've learned so many things from the group assembled before you all today, and so it's a real pleasure for me to be here. Legal scholars too often view Brown in an isolated, juricentric fashion, with the starring roles reserved for the Supreme Court of the United States and, to a lesser extent, the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. But in order to truly understand the Brown era, we need to bring President Eisenhower to center stage. Some critics have suggested that Brown posed a major test for President Eisenhower and that he failed, that he should receive an F for his efforts on this front. There's one scholar who said about President Eisenhower's position toward Brown the following: Thurgood Marshall got his decision, now let him enforce it. That is a comparatively sunny assessment in comparison to Roy Wilkins, no one's idea of a firebrand. He said that if Eisenhower had fought World War II the way that he fought for civil rights, we would all be speaking German right. These critics are, in my view, understandably aggrieved by President Eisenhower's refusal to endorse Brown. He was repeatedly asked at press conferences whether he accepted, whether he thought the decision was correct, and he just equivocated. He said, "I think it makes no difference whether or not I endorse it." This rankled many people, including lions of the civil rights movement. The mighty Constance Baker Motley, Judge Motley, said in her memoir, Eisenhower should never be forgiven for his failure to lead the nation into its new era at that critical time. Never is a long time, so never should he be forgiven. Chief Justice Warren said similar things. That had Warren backed the Supreme Court in the Brown opinion, we would have been able to avoid a whole heap of troubles. So those are the private remarks, but those are the public remarks, the equivocal, but there's also private remarks. President Eisenhower famously invited Chief Justice Warren to the White House, and this was while the Brown decision was pending at the Supreme Court, sat him in close proximity to an important lawyer who had argued in defense of racial segregation. And Eisenhower, in remarks to the new Chief Justice, expressed sympathy for the views of segregationists who were concerned about their daughters sitting next to some, big Black boys in school. This is a significant thing. It goes to the sort of the core of segregationist opposition to desegregation. People feared at the time that integrated classrooms would lead to integrated bedrooms. And it seems to me that this story is significant because it helps to shed light on the relationship between Brown and Brown 2. Many people are, Brown 2 was widely reviled But I do think that these remarks help to understand Chief Justice Warren's all deliberate staid phrasing. He would have had real concerns about whether issuing a decision that required desegregation immediately would have been followed. Did President Eisenhower, have the Supreme Court's back? When push meets shove, the Supreme Court is not just about issuing opinions that are not honored. Somebody has to back them up. This uncertainty, however, was eliminated in 1957 when President Eisenhower famously dispatched the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas, in order to integrate Little Rock Central High School. It seems to me that this is a significant decision, a momentous one that I salute. It's quite plausible to imagine that decision not having been made. And I view that the real scandal of the long Brown era less as being about Brown too. Again, I think it's understandable that they were moving slowly as a result of the uncertainty at the top. The real scandal is the Supreme Court's failure to follow up on the Little Rock desegregation moment with a muscular opinion giving full force to the Brown decision. And they remained silent and on the sidelines until 1968 and the Green decision, until the end of the Johnson administration. So it seems to me that the relationship between President Eisenhower and Chief Justice Warren helped to illuminate this era. I do want to again commend President Eisenhower for dispatching the troops, the 101st Airborne. Justice Breyer, in a parents involved decision from 2007 that some of the law students have read, mentions President Eisenhower's decision to dispatch the 101st Airborne to Little Rock. I was a law clerk for Justice Breyer when that decision was written, and I am glad that it's in the U.S. reports. So if Brown posed a test, it seems to me that kind graders would award President Eisenhower not an F, but at least a gentleman's C. Thanks.
Professor Slime. Well, I'm going to talk about the relationship between President Eisenhower and Chief Justice Warren, which non-incidentally was the subject of my last book. They met in 1952 at the Republican National Convention. At the time, Eisenhower was in a fight with Senator Robert Taft of Ohio for the nomination of the Republican Party. And Warren came to the convention as a favorite son, as a three-time governor of California, a very popular governor who had, over 3 terms, had extended funding for state pensions, for public education, for health care. He did it all while he did not increase the income tax, and he balanced the budget. He was seen at that time as an incredibly charismatic politician. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1944 after only being a governor for just over a year. And Dooley did ask him if he would be interested in vice presidency. He said no. But 4 years later, he ran with Dewey as vice president on the Republican ticket, which lost to Harry Truman. In 1952, he came to the Republican convention as a favorite son of California. He sort of hoped in the back of his mind that there might be a deadlock between Eisenhower and Taft, and that they would look for a compromise candidate. That didn't happen. Robert Taft approached Warren during the convention and offered him his choice of a cabinet position if he would only back Taft for the presidency. He said no, thank you. In fact, he really was much more inclined philosophically to be with Eisenhower, and they met during the convention in Eisenhower's suite. And at the end, they met with reporters at almost an hour meeting, and Warren called that and said that Eisenhower was a great American, and Eisenhower, for his part, said that they were both middle of the road Republicans. They weren't going to fool around and get involved with any picos, but they weren't going to support any reactionaries either. They were going to be middle of the road Republicans. And in fact, during the campaign, Warren campaigned for Eisenhower in a number of states, not just in California, Oregon, and Washington, but throughout the upper Midwest as well. After Eisenhower won in a landslide, Eisenhower called Warren. He said, I don't have room for you in the cabinet. My attorney general is going to be Herbert Brownell, not just for his legal expertise, but his political acumen as well. Brownell was Eisenhower's chief strategist of the 52 convention, but he said, I will, according to Warren's memoirs, you will get the first vacancy on the Supreme Court. Eisenhower thought of it just slightly different. He said, I was inclined to give him the first seat on the court. Well, in the meantime, Brownell, after he became Attorney General, called Warren and said he would offer him the Solicitor General's post in the Eisenhower administration. And Warren was quite interested in it. But in early September, Chief Justice Benson died. He was a terrible Chief Justice, very unauthoritarian, and drove some of the justices absolutely nuts. And in fact, after his death, it was recorded that Frankfurter's quote was, until this moment, I had never believed there might be a God. Frankfurter was very, very dismissive of Benson. So Eisenhower was considering the Chief Justice. He went to Benson's funeral, and afterwards he began to think about it. He wrote two of his brothers, Milton and Edgar, and he told them the kind of person he was looking for. He was looking for someone who had unimpeachable integrity, a reputation for fairness, a good, solid legal background, excellent government experience, and a man of national stature. He was defining for one, in a sense. He wrote his brother Edgar roughly the same thing. Edgar, when rumors had it that he was considering Warren for Chief Justice, Edgar said, please don't. No politicians on the court, said Edgar. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower reacted quite angrily to his brother and said, well, I think he would be a statesman and a very splendid member of the court. And again, he reiterated some of the qualities that he had told his brother Milton. So Warren is named Chief Justice, and Eisenhower praises him and predicts he's going to be a great Chief Justice for all the qualities that he had talked about in private. Well, shortly afterwards, actually, when Fred Vinson was the Chief Justice, they asked for a friend of the court from the administration. So the Eisenhower administration was asked for a friend of the court, amicus brief, which Brownell was quite eager to do, to write. Eisenhower was not so eager. And in fact, he actually tried to put distance between himself and the brief. And he told Governor Burns of South Carolina that that's the Justice Department talking. That's not necessarily me talking. And it showed even then, as Professor Driver suggested, that there was a certain ambivalence to Eisenhower's view toward civil rights. Now, it's ironic because in 1953, the first year of Eisenhower's presidency, he had fulfilled the campaign pledge. He had desegregated the military. He had desegregated the naval grounds. he had desegregated the Veterans Administration. And with the urging of Brownell and with Brownell's litigation, he was able to desegregate the District of Columbia schools and restaurants. This was in 53. This was before the Brown decision. So Eisenhower had a very strong view of civil rights when the federal government had control over it. I think his concern was, because he was a states' rights person too, his concern was what would happen when it got back to the states. And that was his ambivalence. As Professor Driver mentioned, it was most unfortunate that after Brown was argued before the Warren Court in December of 1953, two months later, he had a stag dinner. Eisenhower loved the stag dinners. And he invited Warren to be and sit next to him as the honored guest. But John W. Davis, who had just 2 months ago argued for the state of South Carolina that there should not be desegregation, well, separate but equal was viable, and don't mess with it. And he did it very passionately. And Davis was a very good old friend and advisor to Eisenhower. So he says to Earl Warren, now the Chief Justice of the United States, who 2 months earlier had heard Brown be Board of Education, he said, he's a great man. John W. Davis is a great man. Where was Thurgood Marshall? You didn't see him in the audience. And then afterwards, Eisenhower took Warren aside. This is in Warren's memoirs. Memoirs are not necessarily accurate, but this is Warren's memory. They said, you have to be sympathetic to the white South. These parents are just worried that their sweet little girls, white girls, are going to have to go to school with these overgrown black boys. A racist remark. On the other hand, Eisenhower grew up in a segregated society. He rose in a segregated military. Some of his best friends were white Southerners, so that he was concerned about the views of the South and really worried about it. Right? He said almost nothing, as Professor Driver had said. He just said, well, the Supreme Court, when Brown was delivered, he said it's the law. It should be obeyed. He didn't say it was constitutional. He didn't say that it had a moral imperative. He just said it was the law. A year later, Eisenhower read Justice Department brief for Brown too, and even edited it. And he changed a few phrases. For example, the Justice Department brief had said there should be desegregation as quickly as possible. And Eisenhower changed it when feasible. Again, very sensitive to the concerns of, and he had said privately many, many times then and much later, that law cannot change the hearts and minds of the people. It's going to take time. He later predicted it would take at least 15 years before Brown 2 would be implemented. Well, Colonel Warren was very angry about that. He was very angry that Eisenhower, who was a very popular and very admired president of the United States, did not support Grant. All that he said was the law has to be obeyed. And Warren never forgave him. And it's very interesting that in their memoirs, each of them wrote their memoirs, and Warren took out after Eisenhower right away and talked about his lack of support for Brown v. Board of Education and a few other things. Eisenhower, in his memoir, was much more discreet. But for the first time, he said that Brown was correct. He never said that while he was president. He just said it's the law and needs to be obeyed. He finally said that Brown was correct. But he also said, you know, I don't think the Chief Justice really brought the court together on Brown v. Board, which of course he wouldn't know because he hadn't seen the notes of the justices. Well, in fact, Chief Justice Warren had brought the court together in Brown v. Board of Education. It was hopelessly divided when it was first argued before the bench in court, and he did bring them together. So that's the result. It started out as a very happy collaboration between Warren and Eisenhower, but it did not end up. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, sure. I want to thank Nick for inviting me here and say how happy I am to be back at Columbia Law School. I came here about a dozen years ago and have many close friends here. Love being here. I think Nick invited me because he knew that I had worked with Mr. Brownell about 30 years after the events that we're talking about now. It was a great privilege to be around him. He's a remarkable person. I'll just relate one story from that experience. It was a Miller Center commission on the 25th Amendment, Miller Center being UVA's presidential studies place. And another person on the commission was Warren Burger, who had been Chief Justice of the court when I worked there. And those of you, maybe not so many people any longer remember Burger, but I will tell you, he's not a man who took himself unseriously. And the great encounter was to see the Chief Justice saying, Mr. Brownell, and Mr. Brownell say, Warren. Which, if you knew Burger, that's an amazing thing. I'll cycle back to Mr. Brownell in just a moment, but I'm more of a foreign relations person than I am a civil rights person. That's really been the focus of my scholarship and interest. And with that in mind, I think one of the ways of framing Eisenhower as a civil rights president is to look at Eisenhower as a civil rights general. I think his experience as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe is really an extraordinary. He wouldn't have been president if he hadn't been successful at that. We would not have been, but we would not have gotten out of World War II at lower cost as we did, with the great success that we did, if Eisenhower hadn't been there. And race was very much on his agenda. I think Colin and Jim have already framed Eisenhower pretty well. He was not a person who grew up in a context where civil rights would have been first and foremost in his mind, but he was a person who believed in getting the most out of the resources we had, and he did have an instinctive sense that a segregated society and a segregated army impaired the war-fighting capability of the United States. There was a critical moment in early 1944 when Walter White, who was the executive secretary of the NAACP, met to meet with Eisenhower to talk about race issues in the army in England. There were deep problems because although the English were not known to be hostile to colonialism and race distinctions, but they still looked at Americans as basically barbarians, and thought that the jury segregation that the army brought with them to England was inconsistent with English norms, even though a less formal kind of segregation was something they were very comfortable with. White came to Eisenhower and made a pitch that Eisenhower found compelling, partly because White appealed not to Eisenhower's higher angels, but to the principle of having a more effective war-fighting machine. And he said, when you have two armies, one white, one black, segregated from each other, in conflict with each other, sometimes violence breaking out, when you have an officer corps that's entirely white, that at least a minority of those officers degrading black recruits, you are doing many things that are wrong, but among other things, you are impairing the war-fighting capabilities. And Eisenhower found that appealing. and he took on board White's suggestions, which were first, no longer confining Black soldiers to service, basically digging, but to bring Black divisions to Europe for fighting purpose. And Eisenhower actually did that. The second was to lean down on the training of officers of the existing materials presented to them about commanding Black soldiers was, from our perspective, deeply excessive, but even from the perspective of the 1940s, quite backward looking. And they were replaced with instructions to the officer corps that sought to have them appreciate the humanity and potential of Black soldiers rather than treating them as inferior beings. And then the third part was a hard look at the disproportionate prosecution of African American soldiers, particularly in crimes of violence, and particularly with respect to the death penalty in England during that period. And Eisenhower instructed his JAG to look at that hard and reviewed several cases, including one important case where he not only suspended the capital punishment, but threw out convictions based on insufficient evidence. So what we see in World War II in England is a leader that, one other thing, I'm sorry, during the Battle of Bulge, so after Overlord, still Eisenhower is a supreme commander in Europe, during the Battle of the Bulge, when we were frantic and under-resourced, Eisenhower sought to use integrated, now that he had brought Black warriors to the European theater, he thought that the replacement of lost soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge to be integrated. And it was Marshall who refused to accept that. Not so much as a Southern racist. He was, after all, from Pennsylvania, although from the part that is considered to be Northern Alabama. But more as an institutionalist, that desegregating the Army is a big project, not something to be done in the middle of a war, but to be done afterwards. And so Eisenhower took the initiative of complying with Marshall's judgment, but also subverting it by putting Black platoons alongside white platoons. So he segregated at the level of company, although not at the lower level. So it was left to Truman later to segregate the Army itself. Going forward quickly to Eisenhower and Brownell. I mean, Brownell, I think, deserves two particular credits. One is for drafting the brief in Brown 1, which was not at all the briefs that you necessarily could have gotten from a different attorney general. It was really very much in line with the NAACP position. I'm talking again about Brown 1, not Brown 2. And it made Eisenhower nervous, but Brownell convinced Eisenhower it was the right thing to do. Convinced Eisenhower, which I think Eisenhower already appreciated, that as a foreign relations matter in a world that was approaching decolonization, in a world where the Soviet Union was our principal adversary, that the jury racial segregation in the United States was not only a scandal, which it was, but a foreign relations and a national security liability. And that it had to be attacked gradually. That was Eisenhower's nature, but it did have to be attacked. And the possession taken in Brown, thanks to Brownell, was pretty firm. Then when we come to Little Rock, again, Eisenhower was deeply reluctant to deploy U.S. military domestically in any situation, but to intrude in the conflict that arose in the South after Brown came down, disturbed and ran against his grain. But he also believed that the Constitution was the law of the land. It wasn't. I think his refusal to endorse Brown was not so much a lack of enthusiasm as it was a sense of incompetence. It wasn't the job of the president to pass judgment on Supreme Court opinions, but rather to faithfully implement them. And I think Eisenhower never showed any reluctance to implement it. He may have had reluctance as to what implementation meant. But when it was clearly violated, it was in Arkansas. He used the full resources, including the military. And Mr. Brownell was very much at his ear, pushing him to do that. But Brownell, I think, deserves a lot of the credit in the position that used those resources. And I'll just make one last passing note about Eisenhower. One of Eisenhower's political geniuses that he displayed when he was Supreme Commander, and I think he also displayed when he was president, is he wasn't worried about getting credit for things. He was happy to have other people get the credit for things that he was doing. He gave Montgomery, who was a real penny and a horrible person in many ways, but he had to put up with Montgomery as one of the commanders from Europe. So Montgomery was given credit for the idea of Overlord and for the timing of Overlord, even though it was really Eisenhower's doing. And similarly, I think it is at least plausible to me that he was very comfortable having Brownell take the lead on civil rights, not because he was opposed to civil rights, but just because he thought it was better to farm out the responsibility, share the credit. And I want to make one final quick comment about Eisenhower's approach, since I think it relates to law today. I just spent this morning teaching first-year students, so I'm very much on mind, what we say about law to people who are coming to the profession. And I'll make a very quick generalization. There are very reductive two different approaches to being a lawyer and being a law teacher and being a public official as a lawyer. One is the expressive power of law, the appeal to our higher natures, to set a good example, to push us as firmly as possible towards a better world. The other is to solve problems. That the world is a fallen world, the world has problems, we need to solve them. Without necessarily being convinced that this world with problems solved is necessarily a more superior world, but it's still a better world. That's primarily problem solved. And I think Eisenhower, and I think both are compelling and essential elements of being a lawyer. Eisenhower wasn't even a lawyer, but he did show the approach of problem solving rather than the expressive power of inspiration. And I'm not saying that this is the only way of doing leadership, of being president, of being a good lawyer. I'm just saying it is a way. And what he did, I think he did fairly well.
Thanks. I just wanted to add a bit of a personal note. My father was dean of the Yale Law School from 55 to 65 and knew Herb Brownell pretty well. And my recollection is that he said he was denied appointment to the Supreme Court essentially because of his civil rights advocacy. I received the following note from Guido Calabrese, who was dean of the Yale Law School and judge on the Second Circuit. And unfortunately, he's in his mid-90s and is not participating by webinar. Otherwise, he would read this note himself. And he wrote me saying that I did know Herb Brownell quite well, and I thought he was an extraordinarily interesting and fine person. He was top of the class, et cetera, at the law school. Brownell graduated in 1927 from Yale Law School, and his whole family was much involved with Yale and the school. When I was dean, the distinguished African-American judge Leon Higginbotham Jr. was speaking at Alumni Weekend when Herb Brownell, by then quite old, walked in quietly. He had come to New Haven to see his brother Sam, who was in the hospital, and learning it was Alumni Weekend, though not his year, he decided to stop by. Leon Higginbotham interrupted his speech when he saw him enter and said, quote, "This is the man that has done more for civil rights and integration than anyone else in the country," unquote. He then mentioned the appointments that Brownell had seen to on courts and the positions he had taken, often convincing Eisenhower. The place exploded in cheers. I then and there decided that he should be honored with the law school medal, which he was the following year. So just a bit of extra note on the role of Herb Brownell And now we will hear from Jeremy Kessler.
Thanks, Nick. So I think in considering the puzzle of the relationship between Eisenhower and civil rights, and as I think some of these speakers have already suggested, it remains a puzzle. Three ways of thinking about the puzzle immediately come to mind, and we've already touched on all three of them. One is thinking about Eisenhower as someone committed to federalism, someone committed, like many Midwestern Republicans, as well as Jim Crow Democrats, to a limited national government and substantial authority for state and local governments to set their own policy. A second way to think about him as someone who shared many of the racist and racialist views of both the more elite segments of American society at the time and the more popular masses of a lot of America at the time. And the third way is to focus more deeply on his military background, thinking of Eisenhower as someone who spent most of his life as a soldier. I think all three of these ways of looking at Eisenhower and trying to explain the puzzle will turn out to be true, and they substantially overlap. What I've been asked to touch on briefly is the military piece as it shades from the World War II moment to the presidency and to the 1950s. And so I'm going to reduplicate some of what Paul just told us about, maybe with slightly different emphases, but then turn quickly to the 50s with a little bit on selective service. So I think the thing that is most striking about learning about Eisenhower's military service and the military service during World War II, and then the military he was dealing with as president during the early years of the Cold War, is the extent to which, although I think we often think about the military as one of our most national institutions, as an institution that embodied some possibility of a national polity and national populations, the American military was marked throughout by precisely federalism and by these tremendous traditions of localism that ran through military service, and then just as significantly gave structure to the way we did conscription, compulsory military service throughout World War II and the Cold War, all the way through Vietnam. So you have these huge national institutions, but they mirror, in surprising respects sometimes, the delicate balance between federal and state and local authority that we encounter much more intuitively elsewhere in American law, politics, and society. So I just want to say a little bit about the World War II moment. The best way I think one can summarize Eisenhower's views on the role of Black soldiers during World War II was sort of threefold. And in this, I don't think he was all that exception. I think you can see him echoing the views of a number of commanders of his same generation, class, and cultural background. On the one hand, Eisenhower felt that to the extent that some of the more racist commanders argued that Black soldiers would just not be as good as white soldiers, Eisenhower thought that was a simplification and was wrongheaded. His view was that to the extent that there would be differential performance between Black and white soldiers, it was down to educational differences that he could, particularly as a native of Kansas, trace back to a largely segregated school system. So he was very explicit that he thought that the differentials in education back home would drive differences in performance. Second, he, as Paul noted, definitely thought that it was irrational not to make use of available Black soldiers currently in service units, essentially in the supply chain management side of the Army, particularly as we got into 1944. He absolutely thought that some of those soldiers needed to be mobilized for the Battle of the Bulge and the end of the war. And my understanding, which might differ a little bit from Paul's, is that he was neither the most vocal integrationist within the military at the time, even in this heightened moment, nor was he the most vocal defender of segregation. As Paul already told us, Eisenhower basically brokered a compromise. The one policy that was on the table was integrating Black soldiers from the service units to the fighting lines on an individual volunteer basis. That would have led to the integration at the platoon level, essentially at the fighting unit level. Eisenhower thought that would go too far and lead to racial strife within the units themselves. And so he brokered a compromise where you would have integration at the battalion and certainly at the division level, but not at the sort of fighting unit level. And what Eisenhower said at the time, and what military planners and after-action reports essentially concluded at the end of World War II, was that the more intense the fighting was, the less racial differences became a problem. That cohesion, cross-racial cohesion, was really not a problem when bullets were flying on the front lines. That Black soldiers certainly performed just as effectively and bravely as white soldiers. But the problem that Eisenhower continued to take seriously was downtime, recreation, how to deal with essentially inherited racial strife and racial division when Black and white soldiers were socializing or were off duty. And he saw that as a real social problem, and he felt that could endanger military morale. So he arrives at a position that's somewhere in the middle between a racist position and a non-racist position, an integrationist position and a segregationist position. And I think we can take that as a blueprint, as a quite predictive blueprint to how Eisenhower approached certain military issues and issues involving conscription when he became president, with a notable exception that I'll close with. And so when it came to selective service, right, the way in which we were supposedly building military manpower during the Cold War, Eisenhower, like the heads of selective service, was very opposed to trying to combat the integration of selective service draft boards. He didn't think it was a good thing, but he didn't think there was much he could do about it. And there again, what we saw was this deep military intuition that at a certain point, there's only so much that military command or military service can do, that when you're dealing with these volunteer local draft boards throughout the South, those are exceedingly segregated and exceedingly racist societies, and they're just going to go with decentralization. And for a while, that's also how Eisenhower thought about, as did most of his military contemporaries, thought about the problem of what to do with military bases. Even as in 52, 53, Eisenhower, more so I would say than Truman, is driving the integration of the actual fighting military in real operations and overseas. The question in particular of what to do with military bases within the United States, where you had local communities that fiercely resisted integration. Initially, the military view, consistent with what you saw going back to World War II, is even when we're trying to integrate soldiers, whether at the unit or the division level, we're not going to touch more racist American mores when it comes to downtime, when it comes to socialization, when it comes to settings where soldiers are with their families. But, and this is where I think Eisenhower did break with the mold, is in 1953 and 1954, prior to Brown, Eisenhower finally forces the integration of military bases, and perhaps most notably, both given his background going all the way back to Kansas with segregated schools, and given what we've all been talking about with Brown, Eisenhower eventually does insist in the months leading up to Brown that dependent schools on military bases be integrated. In other words, that Black and white children are going to be integrated on these military bases. So I'm not sure I've really illuminated the puzzle. My instinct is that the the quickest way into the puzzle would be to understand Eisenhower as a reflection of a modal to a slightly more integrationist than modal approach to American racial issues shared by his fellow military commanders. And I think you saw that in World War II, and I think you saw that during his presidency.
And thank you very much, Professor Hitchcock. We will have time for questions. Don't worry.
Greg, can you hear me? Awesome. Good evening. Great to be here. I want to thank the dean. I want to thank Nick for pulling this together. The panelists are terrific. This is an absolutely A+ group of scholars and legal historians. I'm a biographer, and I wrote a book about Eisenhower's presidency. And it was a pretty long book, but I'm going to be very brief because I want to get to some questions. I have 3 questions that I'm going to pose, and I'm going to answer them really quickly. What did Eisenhower think about his own civil rights record? Rather than we'll get to what historians have thought about it, but what did Ike think about it? Second, what did civil rights leaders think about Eisenhower's civil rights record at the time? That's an important dimension for the historian to consider. What was the debate at the time? And then third, how much weight should historians give to the civil rights story when considering the entire presidency? And I'll just throw out some food for thought on each one of those and leave it at that, and we can follow up with questions. So the first question, what would Ike himself say about his civil rights record? It might surprise you to learn that he would not have put it amongst his top 5 achievements. I don't think it would have appeared on his top 10 list of achievements, his entire civil rights record. This is a puzzle because we here are talking about the many ways in which he was an important figure, a transitional figure, but nonetheless an important figure. But he did, at the end of the day, see Brown as something of an overreach, probably too aggressive. He didn't denounce it, but he did not champion it. In 1956, when he was running for re-election, he personally saw that any reference to civil rights and to Brown was removed from the Republican platform. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to make it his issue. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was sadly watered down by Lyndon Johnson, a Southern Democrat, of course. Eisenhower thought about vetoing it. Now, it turns out that it was an important transitional step forward, the first major civil rights act since Reconstruction. But he disliked it so much because it had been so weakened, and he felt very frustrated by the whole thing, and he considered the whole act Brownell's bill, not mine. So he didn't really invest much, quite as much energy into it as perhaps he might have done. And Little Rock, which he is often quite, in retrospect, we hold him up as an extraordinary sort of profile and courage when it comes to Little Rock. He saw that as a failure. He saw the whole story as an embarrassment. He was very uncomfortable with the entire thing. He bent over backwards to try to get Orville Faubus to step down, gave him out after out after out, which Faubus didn't take. And when he finally spoke to the country about Little Rock, he didn't mention civil rights or desegregation at all. He said, this is an issue about states respecting the Supreme Court, period. And I'm here to enforce the Constitution. He never talked about race when he spoke to the country about Little Rock. So Eisenhower himself would not place civil rights at the core of his presidency, or even amongst the central achievements of his presidency. That's part of the puzzle. Second question, what did civil rights leaders of the era think about Eisenhower's record? And as it was alluded to a little earlier, after the cheering died down when the Brown decision came down, there was expectations of rapid change. Those expectations were sadly not met. And there was about a subsequent 4 to 6 years of disappointment among civil rights leaders with Eisenhower as a leader on that issue. The implementation of Brown was slow. Brown, too, was disappointing, a major disappointment. Civil rights leaders asked again and again, where was Eisenhower during the massive resistance in Virginia, among other states in the Union? Where was he on these issues when his voice might have made a difference? Where was he during the Montgomery bus boycott? The young Martin Luther King Jr. Spoke publicly, sent public letters saying, why won't you lend your voice to our cause? He refused to do so. again, I think it's important here to look squarely at the historical record, but also to understand how people debated these issues at the time. Mind you, white Southerners thought Eisenhower was a radical on civil rights in the 1950s. So he was not seen as dragging his feet or in some ways holding up progress. But I also just want to add that second point about how did civil rights leaders at the time view Eisenhower. You all have a program in front of you. This picture actually tells a story. This photograph is the one meeting that Eisenhower held in the White House with civil rights leaders in 1958. And it was a very bad meeting. It went very poorly. The man, everyone is smiling in the picture. The man in the background standing right behind Eisenhower is Fred Morrow, who agonized for years trying to get Eisenhower to meet civil rights leaders. And when Eisenhower did finally meet with these gentlemen, and look, it's an all-star cast of all the greats, Eisenhower said, you guys just keep coming to me asking for more and more, and I keep trying to give you things, and you're still unhappy. Maybe I should stop giving you things. Maybe I should just stop working. In effect, he just told them to go away. This was a disastrous meeting, and it was the one meeting that he basically took with this leadership group. So I think it's really important to talk about the facts as we know them. However, and here I'm going to end by flipping the script a little bit. How much weight should historians give to Eisenhower's civil rights record when considering him as a whole? That was the challenge I faced in writing a study of his whole presidency. And here I think we have to ask the question that historians must ask, which is, what were the available alternatives at the time? What might he have done? We can imagine all kinds of things we would like him to have done, but what were the available alternatives at the time? And when we ask that question, we come up with a much more positive assessment. First of all, if Adlai Stevenson had won the presidency in 1952, probably nobody except some of the more scholarly buffs here know that Stevenson's running mate was John Sparkman, who was an ardent segregationist from Alabama. The Democratic Party was profoundly riven on the question of race, and they were deeply in favor of segregation. Adlai Stevenson wasn't, but he wasn't going to buck his party on this. So had the Democrats won in the 50s, things would have been even worse, believe it or not. True. He could have appointed a much lesser figure than Herb Brownell as Attorney General. We've heard of what an extraordinary figure he was, how well he navigated the political limitations of the time and of Eisenhower to achieve all of the things that he did. Eisenhower was thinking about appointing John Davis to be the Supreme Court the Chief Justice. I mean, he could have appointed someone other than Earl Warren, but he chose Warren knowing that Warren was a liberal on civil rights. He knew Warren's record. Brownell told him. So these are decisions that had enormous consequences over time. He could have rejected any action on civil rights and not worked on the Civil Rights Act of 1957 at all. He could have just said, it's not my problem. I don't know anything about this. I've got other things to do. Khrushchev is threatening to blow up the world. I don't want to deal with it. But he allowed it to move forward. It was Brownell's project, but he supported him up to a point. He also could have denounced Brown publicly. He could certainly have spoken publicly against it. He didn't. Some people say, well, you know, that press conference when he said, oh, I'll obey the law, that was scripted by him and Haggerty. I mean, they agreed on that language. That was purposeful. That was deliberate. That wasn't in any way suggesting they didn't agree with the decision. It was simply to say, the Supreme Court has spoken. We're not going to relitigate it here at this press conference. That's a reasonable response, it seems to me. And of course, he could have ignored Little Rock completely. And there are many other presidents in the 1950s, some of those figures who would have liked to have been president, who would certainly have said, gee, what can I do? Orville Faubus has got to run his own shop down there. There's really nothing we can do up here. And Eisenhower, of course, didn't make that decision. And he did, at considerable political risk, send in the 101st. Now, the reason he agonized over it, one of the reasons, was because he viewed this as fulfilling the dark prophecies of the Southern Democrats who had been saying, if you enforce segregation, you'll have to do it at the end of a bayonet. Desegregation, I mean. If you enforce desegregation, you'll have to do it with armed force. And here Eisenhower, it turned out, had to do it at the end of a bayonet. And he hated doing it for that reason, but he did it anyway. So we have to balance the fact that the record is unflattering in some respects to Eisenhower on civil rights, but we also have to understand the limited available political action that would have been available to a different person at the same time in the same circumstances. And given all of those circumstances, and given who Eisenhower was as a person and the life that he had led in a segregated military, I think it's important to recognize that he was a crucial transitional figure in establishing a fairer and more equal United States by the end of his term when it came to an end in 1961. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Nick, and for all those who participated in the organization of this event, including Elizabeth. So I come at this not as a legal historian, but as a lawyer, as someone who has worked in civil rights, also teaches and writes in the area of civil rights and in administrative law and constitutional law. I think, like many other people in the audience who are civilians, non-historians, non-Eisenhower heads, I was introduced to Eisenhower through a different photograph. We're talking about this photograph as being an iconic photograph, but the photograph I was introduced to Eisenhower through is one that many of you have seen of the 101st Airborne escorting 9 Black children into Little Rock, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So this is an image we see in documentaries, photographs that have been depicted in paintings, right? And I thought of it as a time, not in terms of the puzzle that you all are talking about, and I think folks are somewhat tortured about trying to solve, but really as a valiant moment in American history. And soon after, I mean, you become a lawyer, certainly as a law professor, I see it a lot differently. I mean, I see it very much about the frailty of courts, that their decisions aren't automatically followed without some sort of power behind them, questioning of the legitimacy of courts. I see it as a moment that really illustrates the fissures in American society, that there wasn't an immediate accession to the decision or a sense of moral and democratic duty or care with relation to your neighbors and to children in your community. You actually needed military power to effectuate those outcomes. And that really sits with me. A lot of my Civ Pro students here, we did Walker versus City of Birmingham about the power of federal courts and the limited power of the Supreme Court and whether you had to comply with court decisions. And this moment, of course, stands in contrast to that. I was asked to talk about the legacy, and just in the short time that we have remaining, I just wanted to highlight some things that I haven't come up squarely about the legacy. So one is the fact that military force and the National Guard in particular had to be invoked for this crisis. It's not the first time the National Guard had ever been called, but it wouldn't be the last time with regard to race in the United States. It's a reoccurring feature that we now often think of as quite normal. We expect it at moments of crisis, but it was, as Professor Hitchcock has talked about, a very dramatic moment at the time. JFK would call out the National Guard for very similar purposes and military for similar purposes of desegregation with regard to James Meredith at the University of Mississippi, protecting Shuttlesworth, Y.T. Walker, and Martin Luther King and others during the Birmingham campaign. And then through the 60s, it took on a very different tenure, the use of the military and the National Guard on American soil. You had, of course, the 1967 uprisings. These are before the assassination of Martin Luther King. They're part of what inspires the Kerner Commission in Detroit and Newark, and that resulted in deaths of people when there were urban, what the Kerner Commission called urban uprisings and riots. And then, of course, you have the protests, the anti-war protests, Kent State being the most poignant. And I point this out, not to question Eisenhower's willingness to deploy federal troops in Arkansas. It's rather to emphasize that the need to call in federal troops is something that we should take stock of, that peace is fragile in this way, how there's an edge of political violence at the I wouldn't say at the core, but maybe at the edges of American society, and particularly around race and civil rights. Um, so Brown is an obvious part of the legacy. There's a lot to say about Brown. Even more, I know Justin has a lot to say about Brown. I think it's a poignant time. That I think this is about the fifth or sixth Brown event I have done this year, and I'm increasingly conflicted about them because, and we can get into this more. I wasn't even going to say this, but we haven't fully desegregated our schools, right? And so that's always the conflict at the core. But I still think Brown is an important moment in signaling um, an aspiration to equal citizenship, education as core to democratic values, and about the role of the court in enforcing that. I think even with the puzzle that you all have illustrated, there's something that Eisenhower's engagement in the issue at all illustrates, and that's that it would need federal power in order to effectuate that. That the federal government couldn't be at the sidelines of those goals, and so you see that um, later on, of course, dramatically, not just in the remedial decisions by the Supreme Court that say, okay, we can do student assignment and busing, Green and Swan, that would come later, but also in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when Congress put its heft through federal funding behind desegregation by saying, hey, you could lose your federal funds if you don't move towards integration. So I do see this as I'd say the puzzle that I'm less tortured by in Eisenhower's record is the idea that he understood the need to mobilize federal power for that project, as ambivalent as he was about it. I learned more about Burnell through your remarks, your books on these than I had known. I knew about the 1957 Civil Rights Act, and the way in which we talk about it in civil rights is as a failure, but the thing, or just too limited, too weak, and that's how Eisenhower, so we've heard, understood it. It had a very important shift in it. I mean, two things I would note. One is that the Department of Justice before had relied mostly on criminal power, its criminal authority. And the 57 Act really emphasized the use of civil litigation as a way of dealing with and advancing civil rights. That is core to what the Department of Justice continues to do. It also, yes, was just about voting, but he also started the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. There are questions about whether or not the Civil Rights Division maintains its authority and integrity, across administrations. But I think it's notable that there aren't real projects to completely eviscerate it. I said this intentionally. There aren't. There are contestations over what its priorities should be. But Congress has steadily expanded what the Civil Rights Division does, most recently with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. So I think all of that is part of what I would cite as part of a positive legacy. I think it gets completed by, maybe I shouldn't say his name because he's already been taken in a negative way, but, it gets completed by LBJ, right? So you get the 64, 65, and 68 in all of that. But a lot of that, that infrastructure starts with Eisenhower. So ending, I'll end on what I guess call a blue note. As a scholar, the way I got interested in Eisenhower was looking at the role of the interstate highway system in segregation and also urban renewal with regard to housing. So this is at odds. It's a tension with Brown. It's actually what makes the integration project difficult is that you have forms of spatial segregation that are created by highways and the city-suburban divide. You had the relocation and displacement of Black communities, Black businesses, and destruction of Black wealth. Eisenhower is a champion of the interstate highway system for reasons that are just noble, valiant, important, economic reasons, national security reasons that make perfect sense. There was a failure that was there in real time to put civil rights protections in, or even to show adequate concern about the communities that were being affected. And that's an important part of the legacy. And part of the legacy is also that we are reckoning with that legacy. When the Biden administration came in, it actually had a set of administrative rules on that had to do with repairing that particular administrative history with regard to transit. And this has been a longer standing campaign with regard to housing. That's that whole contestation over the affirmatively furthering fair housing provisions. Those are there because we recognize the federal government played a role. So I'll end with that, and just say that my personal debt is that I looked and read a lot of historians in this area, including Arnold Hirsch, who get into the administrative records because I was very fascinated by what was the role of Eisenhower and some of the people in his administration. How much do they know about urban renewal and its effects? And you find that there were a surprising number of missed opportunities to put affirmative civil rights protection. But that's part of the legacy that we grapple with. I think it's okay to have these puzzles and these ambivalences. It's the nature of American history around race and probably other areas too.
Thank you very much. I'd like to offer to our audiences, both here and online, an opportunity to ask questions. And so I'd like to collect some questions. If there's a few questions in the audience, live audience, anybody? Yes.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I do appreciate all of your hard work and deep dive into make those good. This is for Paul and for Gary. I have no idea that Eisenhower was an early spokesperson for desegregation in 1944. Not only not understanding a little bit about Eisenhower, how he spoke in the wonderful quote, I'm curious and there's a possibility of some of his actions. When we're speaking about the mixing the blacks and the whites, or trying to in your history or in your research, can you come up with any writing where he kind of like tell the troops this is what I'm thinking about doing, and having the troops who might still be, segregation-minded soldiers, did you ever speak to them like, this is what I think, probably, God, let's create, let's try to prevent any anarchy because of your opinions about desegregation?
Before, I want to collect some questions here. So, I'd like to ask one more question here, and then I want to go to Hillsdale College, where I know there are questions, and the University of Alabama.
A question for Professor Hitchcock. What role, if any, did civil rights play in the 1960 election and in the 1956 presidential election?
Okay. And Hillsdale College, I don't know how this works, but they're I know they have a question. I don't know what it is, but I know they have one.
Hi there. We had a question for the panel at large, and Professor Kessler. You had made a passing comment to the military reflecting federalism in some different ways. We were wondering if you could kind of expound on that point.
And I think I'll take one more because that was really short. That's nice. From the university. Right, your answer can be very long, but let's give the University of Alabama Law School a chance. Northern Alabama. Hello.
Hi, my name is Luke Todd with the University of North Alabama. We'd like to thank all of you for having us. Our question was, the panelists talked a lot about Eisenhower as a Federalist, Eisenhower as a military man. We wanted to know, in what ways was Eisenhower the right personality for the moment at the dawn of the modern civil rights era? In what ways was he a mismatch for that moment? Thank you.
Okay. Panelists, we have one question about Eisenhower and the desegregation of the Army. Did he convey in any way to the troops what he had in mind? what was the role of civil rights in the 1956 and 1960 presidential elections? A question about Eisenhower and federalism, and was he a mismatch for civil rights?
So very quickly, Nick, on the 1944. So one of Walter White's recommendations to Eisenhower was that the officer corps was a problem. Elements of the officer corps was a problem, and Eisenhower responded to that by commissioning a new set of manuals. And the military is a place where manuals are a big deal. You know, they write things down, and particularly when you're not in the heat of battle, they can be meaningful. And that was an important change. I thought the other part of your question was what was his process of getting there? And I'll defer to Jeremy, but my impression is that he consulted with his superiors and he ordered his inferiors, that there wasn't a lot of bottom-up decision making. I don't think the Army is generally structured that way.
Yeah, I'll just that tracks my own understanding, and I'll just add my senses. So there's a very good resource which I know Professor Hitchcock cites and draws on in the Agent Eisenhower book by Morris McGregor on Army integration, 1940 to 1965, and it actually includes, it's a defense studies publication, and it includes a wealth of excellent archival research, primarily dealing with Eisenhower's essentially negotiations with his superiors and with some, if not inferiors, folks essentially near his level. And what those negotiations look like is a pretty deliberative weighing in which he's trying to push aside some voices that are just kind of openly segregationist for segregationist sake. But on the other hand, pushing back against some folks who really want to do this individual integration into fighting units. And the way Eisenhower describes it as weighing two stressors on the efficiency of military manpower at the front. On the one hand, an absence of Black soldiers at the front is clearly a means of degrading the full potential of the fighting force in 44. On the other hand, he is concerned about what he perceives as potential morale problems that would come from integration. And he has a very kind of open dialogue about this with some of his superior officers. I'll just take quickly the question about federalism and the military. What I meant by that is, and this comes through in these discussions precisely in 1944, all the way through the controversies about military base integration in 53 and 54, so that over that decade, we can think of when military units are overseas, we could think of them as representatives in some sense of the United States, but they are composed of soldiers from very different backgrounds back home, backgrounds that are themselves reflective of our very robust federalist structure. So that's one way in which the military culture has this federalist element, or certainly did at that time. I think it still does today to some extent. But the other way it really comes out is the fact that a lot of military organization and military morale is not about what's going on the front lines of combat. It's about base assignments. It's about being in different parts of the country and even different parts of the world that have different racial mores, and the way in which different officers, different groups of soldiers, and different local communities will respond to the presence of soldiers. And this was a famous scandal in World War II when you had Black soldiers returning home and in Korea, and were subject to vicious discrimination in Southern and also West Coast, East Coast Army bases. So that's what I mean. The military can't just lift itself up out of the highly decentralized structure of American culture and American power.
Can I move on to the election question? There was a question about race and the subsequent campaigns, and I don't have a great deal to impart. I'm sure I hope some of the other panelists will illuminate this question further. again, back to the photograph on the cover. Two men and two of the staff on this photograph, Rocco Siciliano and Fred Morrow, very much wanted the Republican Party to become once again the party of Lincoln and the party of Black Americans. And they really hoped that Eisenhower's civil rights record would help to win back Black Americans who had left because of the New Deal and the Roosevelt legacy. And so part of their strategy in creating photographs like this was precisely to demonstrate that the Republican Party was a modern progressive party and would be the party of the future. However, the one guy who's not in this picture, I don't think, is Richard Nixon. We haven't mentioned him much, but and we have much too little time to really dig into the Nixon story. But of course, Nixon will run in 1960 and will lose very narrowly. The number of Black voters declines, doesn't completely fall off the edge of the table, but it declines for the GOP in 1960, and then of course it starts to progressively diminish from then. Nixon draws the lesson that the Republican Party's not going to win back Black votes, so let's forget about it. And he begins to plot for his next time when he runs in 1968. And wins using the infamous Southern strategy, in which the Republican Party will become the party of the white South. So here is a question about the legacy of Eisenhower. Again, it is a puzzle. One of the biggest puzzles of Eisenhower's presidency is, why did he choose Richard Nixon to be his vice president? And then to what extent did he really want Nixon to become president ever, 1960 or 1968? I think that's an open-ended question, and we do actually know some of the answers as to why he picked Nixon, and we don't need to go into them here. But I do think here again, it's a Rorschach test. I mean, how do we want to see Eisenhower and his legacy with respect to race? There's an awful lot. There's a really good story to tell, but I think again and again, what's surprising is that Eisenhower himself really didn't tell it.
Let me just comment on the 1960 presidential election. In fact, John F. Kennedy, the Democratic candidate, made more of civil rights than Nixon did. And in fact, pointedly, it was during the sit-in demonstration, the luncheon, he said during the campaign that the president should take a leadership role in civil rights. And he was very clear on that. And Bobby Kennedy talked to Martin Luther King, so that the Democratic ticket sort of embraced the civil rights movement much more than the Republicans did.
Then there was the one question about whether he was a mismatch.
Can you?
I think the question was Eisenhower a mismatch on civil rights?
Well, let me try to rephrase it this way. Presidents are always faced with crises and problems they don't anticipate. They don't get to pick the crises that come to them. And it's the test of a successful presidency as to whether you, despite not knowing the issue or not having anticipated it, you didn't know there was going to be a pandemic. You didn't know there was going to be a war somewhere. You didn't know there was going to be a civil rights crisis. I mean, he should have known, but there was already a civil rights crisis. But you know what I mean. The issue, Eisenhower did not seek the civil rights issues, but they found him. And I think when you look at it that way, this was not something he had thought about all of his life. But when he becomes president, finally he's going to have this opportunity. But given those restraints, I think it's quite remarkable to see how he grew into the role. And yes, there's many ways in which he didn't meet our expectations, but I think it's quite remarkable when you see where he began and what the alternatives could have been. He may have been a mismatch for his time, but I in some respects, none of us knows what's coming, so we're all a little bit out of sync with the future.
May I just say, one way to understand President Eisenhower is that he was the perfect match for his time rather than a mismatch. That is to say, that there was deep ambivalence in the United States in the 1950s about the issue of racial equality. And so if he was uncertain, he had a lot of company on that front. He was a good politician in understanding that opposition to desegregation was a core value for many Southerners. And you can understand him in this famous exchange about saying, these Southerners are not bad people. They don't want their daughters to. So you might understand him not to be expressing his own view on the question, but instead channeling, Southerners and segregationists. And that's what an effective politician is charged with doing. One way to understand the difference between President Eisenhower in 1954 and 1957 in Little Rock is there's a little thing called 1956, which is to say he was reelected president of the United States. He didn't have to worry about winning the South any longer, and that may have liberated him to channel his inner racial egalitarian.
When it's on the Little Rock, and Brownell was the one who was pushing Eisenhower. Eisenhower equivocated for quite some time. He invited Faubus to his vacation retreat to try to talk him into it. It was Brownell who was pushing him the whole way and told Eisenhower at one time, Faubus isn't going to come around. He's not going to. And finally, Eisenhower said, Herb, you were right.
Well, I think that this has been a very illuminating discussion, and I want to thank our panelists. I'm sorry we never got to the Stanford Law School, but hey, it's the West Coast, and it's just the way life is. And so I want to thank our panelists and give them a round of applause.